At my daughter's wedding, I overheard her tell her rich mother-in-law, "She's just a pathetic failure, nothing like you." So I stood up during toasts and played a message her deceased father had recorded before he died. The room fell completely silent. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The ballroom of the St. Regis Atlanta was a universe of shimmering crystal and the soft, intoxicating scent of 1,000 white lilies. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music a delicate silver thread weaving through the low, powerful hum of conversations. This was the world my daughter Naomi had chosen. A world of old money, of quiet, unshakable influence, a world that was a universe away from the one she had come from. I sat at my designated table, a small, solitary island in this glittering sea, and felt a familiar, quiet ache settle in my chest. I was the mother of the bride. An honored position, yet I had never felt more like an outsider. My dress, a simple, elegant sheath of deep violet that I had sewn myself, felt like a homespun thing in a room of couture gowns. The other women at my table, the wives of senators and CEOs, spoke of summering in the Hamptons and ski trips to Aspen. I had spent my summer tending to the community garden in my neighborhood. My name is Sarah Brooks, and for 40 years my life was a symphony of a different kind. It was the sound of off-key recorders in my elementary school music class, the joyful chaos of the school choir, the proud swelling notes of the high school marching band. My life was rich in a way these people would never understand. Rich with the bright, shining faces of children discovering the magic of music for the first time. It was a good life, a life of purpose. But it was not a life of wealth, and in the eyes of my daughter I knew that was a cardinal sin. I watched her now, a vision in a cloud of white lace. As she moved through the room, she was breathtaking. She had her father's radiant smile and my eyes, though hers held a restless, ambitious fire that had never been in my own. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her hand resting on the arm of her new husband, Lawrence Sinclair. He looked at her with a pure, uncomplicated adoration that was almost painful to watch. He was a good boy from a good, powerful family, and he had no idea who he had just married. In my small beaded purse my fingers found the cool, smooth metal of the digital recorder. It was a small, simple thing, a final gift from my late husband James. A secret I had kept for 2 years, a promise. My heart ached with the memory of him, with the profound, grounding weight of his love. He should have been here. He would have known what to say, how to bridge the chasm that had opened up between me and our daughter. I looked across the room at the matriarch of this new, powerful family. Naomi was joining. Genevieve Sinclair, Lawrence's mother, was a woman who radiated a quiet, formidable power. She was a legend in Atlanta real estate, a self-made titan in a world of men. She was everything Naomi aspired to be, wealthy, influential, and utterly, completely in control. Next to her, I felt like a pale, insignificant shadow, a broke and pathetic failure, the very words my daughter would soon use to describe me. My world, the one I had built with James, was a small 2-story house in Grant Park, a neighborhood of historic homes and a fierce artistic soul. Our house was always filled with music. James was a jazz pianist, a local legend with a Grammy nomination to his name, and a talent so profound, it felt like a force of nature. Our evenings were spent on the front porch, the sound of his soulful, intricate melodies drifting out into the humid Georgia night, a free concert for the entire neighborhood. Our wealth was not in a bank account, it was in the rich, vibrant tapestry of the life we had woven, a life of art, of community, of a deep and abiding love. The Sinclair's world, as I understood it, was a penthouse in Buckhead with a view that stretched to the horizon. It was a world of silent, efficient elevators, of cool marble floors and art that was chosen not for its beauty, but for its investment value. It was a world of quiet, powerful phone calls and discreet, high-stakes deals. Genevieve Sinclair had built an empire of glass and steel, a testament to her own brilliant, relentless ambition. I respected her. How could I not? She was a trailblazer, a powerful black woman who had conquered a world that was not designed for her. But her world and mine were 2 different planets, orbiting the same sun of Atlanta but with vastly different atmospheres. In her world, success was measured in square footage and stock portfolios. In mine, it was measured in the number of children whose lives you had touched. In the beauty of a perfectly executed musical phrase. I remembered the first time Naomi had brought Lawrence home to meet us. Our home, which I had always seen as warm, comfortable, and filled with love, had suddenly looked through my daughter's anxious eyes, small, and cluttered, and old. She had spent the entire week before his visit frantically trying to declutter, a euphemism for hiding the evidence of her parents' bohemian, unwealthy lives. She had taken down the concert posters from her father's early days. She had hidden his worn beloved saxophone case. She had tried to convince me to put away the vibrant, chaotic, and in her eyes, tacky quilts my own grandmother had made. "I just want to make a good impression, Mom," she had said, her voice tight with a stress that was all out of proportion to the situation. Lawrence, to his credit, had been nothing but gracious and kind. He had complimented my cooking. He had talked to James about music with a genuine intelligent curiosity. He had seen the richness in our lives, the value that could not be quantified on a balance sheet. But Naomi had not seen his admiration. She had only seen the judgment she was so sure he was making. She was a translator, constantly apologizing for us with her eyes, trying to reframe our authentic life into a language of acceptable quaint eccentricity for her new wealthy boyfriend. It was the beginning of her long, slow and deeply painful erasure of us, and of herself. The shame was not a new thing. It had been a quiet, constant undercurrent in our relationship for years. A ghost at every family gathering. I had tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just a phase, a normal part of a child separating from her parents. But it wasn't. It was a deep corrosive thing that had taken root in her soul. The memory that always came back to me, the one that was a perfect painful diorama of her shame, was from her junior year of high school. It was the day of her spring formal. She was beautiful, a vision in a dress that had cost more than our monthly mortgage payment, a dress I had worked an entire summer of private music lessons to afford. James and I were supposed to drive her to the dance. It was a tradition, but that afternoon, our old, reliable and deeply unfashionable Volvo had refused to start. The starter, James had said with a sigh. It was a common problem, an easy fix for him, but not a quick one. Her date, a handsome boy from a wealthy family, was picking her up. His father was a surgeon. They lived in a mansion in Tuxedo Park. It's fine, Naomi had said, her voice a high, tight wire of panic as she watched for his car through the living room window. "You don't have to drive me." Just then her father, a proud man who could fix anything, had a brilliant and, in her eyes, horrifying idea. "Don't you worry, sweetie," he'd said, his face lighting up. "I'll get you there. The show must go on." He had disappeared into the garage and had returned a moment later with the keys to his other vehicle. His work vehicle. His gig van. It was a 20-year-old rust-flecked Ford Econoline, the side of which was still emblazoned with the faded, peeling logo of his old jazz quartet, the Bourbon Street Ramblers. The look on Naomi's face was one of pure, unadulterated horror. "No," she had whispered, her voice a choked, strangled thing. "Absolutely not. I am not arriving at my prom in that." "What's wrong with it?" James had asked, his voice full of a genuine, wounded confusion. "It runs great. I just rebuilt the engine." "It's a clown car, Dad?" she had shrieked, her carefully constructed composure finally shattering. "It's embarrassing. I would rather die than have anyone see me in that rust bucket." The word had hung in the air between them. Embarrassing. James, my gentle, soulful and deeply proud husband, had looked as if she had physically struck him. He had looked at the van, a symbol of his life's passion, of the music that was the very air he breathed, and he had seen it, for the first time, through his daughter's cruel, unforgiving eyes. In the end, she had taken a taxi. James had said nothing. He had just gone back into the garage and had quietly closed the door, but something had broken between them that day. A small, essential piece of the trust and unconditional love that had always been the foundation of our family. He had seen the depth of her shame, her rejection of his world, and it had wounded him in a way that I don't think ever truly healed. It was a wound she was about to tear open again, on her wedding day in front of the whole world. 2 years ago, in the final quiet weeks of his life, the cancer had taken James's strength, but it had not touched his mind. If anything, it had made him sharper, more focused, as if the proximity of death had burned away all of life's non-essential distractions. He spent his days in our sun-drenched bedroom, propped up on pillows, a yellow legal pad and a pen always at his side, scribbling down musical notations, last thoughts and letters to the people he loved. It was on one of those quiet, sunlit afternoons that he had called me to his bedside. His voice was a weak, reedy version of its former soulful rumble, but his eyes were as clear and as bright as ever. "Sarah," he'd said, his hand thin and papery, reaching for mine, "there's something I need you to do for me." He had gestured to the small digital audio recorder on his nightstand. a simple device he used to capture snippets of melody when he was too weak to write them down. "I'm recording something for Naomi," he'd explained. "A message, for her wedding day, a day I know I'm not going to see." My heart had clenched, a familiar painful spasm of grief. "Oh, James," I had whispered, "don't talk like that." "Hush now," he'd said, his grip on my hand surprisingly strong. "This is important. This is a father's last words to his little girl. I want her to have it. I want her to hear my voice, to know how proud I am of her, how much I love her." He had paused, his breathing shallow. "But Sarah," he had continued, his gaze becoming intense, serious. "This message, it's for you too. It's a tool, a shield. I see the way she is, the world she's so desperate to be a part of. And I worry about you. I worry that one day she will get so lost in that world of money and status that she will forget where she came from, that she will forget us." He had picked up the small, silver recorder and pressed it into my palm. Its metallic coolness was a stark contrast to the warmth of his skin. "So here is my promise to you, my love," he had said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "I am leaving this for you to protect you. You will give this to her on her wedding day. But you will only play it under one condition. You will only play it if you feel she has truly, completely forgotten who we are. You will only play it if she says something, or does something, that dishonors the life we built, the love we shared. You will only play it if you need to remind her." He had looked at me, his eyes shining with a fierce protective love. "Think of it as my last solo, Sarah," he had whispered, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "A final loving amen from the old man. A way to be there even when I'm gone. A way to make sure no one, not even our own daughter, ever makes my beautiful wife feel small." I had taken the recorder, tears streaming down my face, and I had promised. It was a sacred final vow. I had put the recorder away in a safe place, in a small velvet-lined box with his other precious things, and I had not looked at it since. I had hoped with all my heart that I would never have to. I had hoped that I could simply give it to Naomi, a private loving message from the father she had lost. But now, as I sat at this lavish wedding, a stranger in my own daughter's new life, I was beginning to understand the full, prescient wisdom of my husband's final gift. He had seen the storm clouds gathering long before I had, and he had, in his final act of love, handed me a lightning rod. The reception was a masterful and deeply exhausting performance. I smiled until my face ached. I made polite, meaningless conversation with people whose names I would forget in 5 minutes. I ate a piece of ridiculously expensive sea bass that tasted like ashes in my mouth, and all the while I was watching. I was watching my daughter Naomi, who was the radiant gravitational center of this entire glittering universe. She was brilliant. I had to admit, she moved through the powerful, wealthy crowd with a practiced easy grace, her laughter a perfect musical sound, her hand resting lightly on the arm of her handsome, adoring new husband. She was playing the part of the new Mrs. Sinclair to perfection. She belonged here, or rather she had made herself belong. About an hour into the reception, after the main course had been served and the champagne had been flowing freely, I felt a wave of profound, suffocating weariness wash over me. It was not a physical tiredness. It was a weariness of the soul, the noise, the lights, the sheer relentless effort of my own performance. It was all becoming too much. I needed a moment of quiet. I needed to escape. I slipped away from my table, my movements discreet, unnoticed. I wandered away from the grand and noisy ballroom, my hand trailing along the cool marble walls of the museum. I found what I was looking for down a quiet, dimly lit hallway, a small glass-enclosed atrium, a sort of indoor garden filled with potted palms, ferns, and the soft, gurgling sound of a small stone fountain. The space was deserted, a quiet, green sanctuary from the chaos of the reception. I found a small wrought iron bench tucked away behind a large leafy fiddle-leaf fig tree, and I sat. The air in here was cool and smelled of damp earth and green, living things. It was a blessed relief. I closed my eyes for a moment, just breathing. I took the small silver recorder out of my purse. I didn't turn it on, I just held it in my hand, its familiar cool weight a connection to my James, a silent comforting presence in my solitude. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, a quiet, unseen figure in the shadows of the lush foliage. I was just about to stand up and rejoin the party. My brief respite over, when I heard voices. 2 women, their voices low and confidential, had entered the atrium from the other side. seeking as I had a private space to talk. I froze. I was completely hidden from their view by the thick screen of plants. To stand up now would be to reveal myself, to create an awkward, embarrassing scene. So I stayed perfectly still, an accidental eavesdropper, hoping they would be brief. And then I recognized the voices. One was the voice of Genevieve Sinclair, Lawrence's mother. It was a low, cultured, and deeply authoritative voice. The other voice was my daughter's. It was Naomi's. My heart gave a small, painful lurch. They were having a private mother and daughter-in-law moment, and I was about to be an unwilling witness to it. I remained frozen on the bench, a prisoner in my green, leafy sanctuary. The sound of the small stone fountain seemed to amplify in the quiet atrium, its gentle gurgling a counterpoint to the frantic, panicked thumping of my own heart. This felt wrong, a deep, profound violation of their privacy, but I was trapped. I could only sit and wait, and listen. "It really is a beautiful wedding, Naomi," Genevieve Sinclair's voice said. It was a polite, neutral, and slightly perfunctory compliment, the kind of thing one says at such events. "You have a wonderful eye for detail." "Thank you, Genevieve," Naomi replied, and her voice was a sound I knew all too well. It was her impress the important people voice, a tone of bright, eager-to-please deference, laced with a carefully curated sophistication. I wanted everything to be perfect, to reflect the standard of the Sinclair family. The subtle sycophantic flattery was not lost on me. She was not just a bride, she was a courtier paying homage to the queen. "Your mother seems like a very sweet woman," Genevieve said then, and the shift in topic was so sudden, so unexpected, that it sent a jolt of pure cold dread through me. It was another polite, neutral observation, a simple conversational pleasantry, but I knew, with a sudden sick certainty, that it was a test, and I knew with an even sicker certainty, that my daughter was about to fail it in the most spectacular and heartbreaking way imaginable. I held my breath. I could feel the small, cold weight of the recorder in my hand. "Don't," I prayed to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. "Please, Naomi, don't." I heard Naomi let out a small, delicate, and utterly dismissive laugh. It was a sound I had never heard from her before, a sound of pure, condescending arrogance. "Oh, she's sweet enough," she said, her voice dropping to a low, confidential murmur, a voice meant to create an intimate, secret alliance with the powerful woman she was speaking to. In her own way, very simple. The word simple was a dagger. It was a word she had used to describe me before, always with a faint, pitying smile. She meant it as an insult, a synonym for unsophisticated, for unintelligent. "But," Naomi continued, and I could hear the rustle of her expensive dress as she shifted her weight, leaning in closer to Genevieve, "she is just a broke, and a pathetic failure. Nothing like you." The words, the terrible, ugly, and unforgivable words. They hit me with the force of a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs in a silent, ragged gasp. I literally could not breathe. My hand flew to my mouth, to stifle the small, wounded sound that was trying to escape my throat. A broke and a pathetic failure. This was what she thought of me. My daughter, the child I had raised, the woman whose lavish wedding I was currently sitting in, a wedding paid for by 40 years of my pathetic failure of a life. The cruelty of it was so profound, so absolute, that my mind couldn't quite process it. It was a truth so monstrous that my heart refused to believe it, even as my ears were telling me it was real. I sat there, hidden in the shadows of the ferns, and I felt my entire world, the world I had so carefully, so lovingly constructed around the central pillar of my love for my daughter, begin to splinter and crack. The foundation was giving way, and the worst I knew was yet to come. The silence that followed Naomi's brutal assessment of me was thick and heavy. I could picture the scene on the other side of the leafy barrier. Genevieve Sinclair, her expression likely one of polite, non-committal interest. A powerful woman listening to a potential new asset reveal her own character. She was not a gossip, she was a strategist, and this I knew was valuable intelligence for her. I prayed that Naomi would stop, that she would realize she had gone too far, that she would backtrack, that she would say something, anything to soften the blow of her own cruel words. But she did not. Emboldened by Genevieve's silence, by her own desperate need to align herself with this new powerful mother figure, she continued. She decided to twist the knife. "My father was the same way," Naomi said, her voice now a sad, pitying sigh, the voice of a woman who has had to overcome the great tragedy of her own loving, unambitious parents. "A dreamer, a wonderful musician, of course, but no head for business. No real drive. They never understood ambition. They were content in their small, little world. The dismissal of her father, of my James, was in some ways an even deeper and more unforgivable betrayal. To speak of him like that, of his passion, of the soulful, beautiful life he had lived, as a failure, as a lack of drive, it was a desecration of his memory. He had been the kindest, most soulful man I had ever known. His wealth was not in his bank account, it was in his music, in his laughter, in the immeasurable love he had given to us, to his daughter, and she was now in this quiet plant-filled atrium, casually and cruelly, pissing on his grave. That's why I am so grateful, she continued, her voice now taking on a bright sycophantic tone, to finally have a true role model. A woman who understands what it takes to build an empire. A woman who isn't afraid of power. I've learned more from you in the past 6 months, Genevieve, than I did from my own mother in my entire life. The flattery was so transparent, so nakedly ambitious that it was almost pathetic. She was not just insulting her past, she was trading it in right here in this quiet hidden corner of her own wedding for a newer, shinier and more profitable model. She was trying to surgically remove her own roots, to present herself to this new family as a woman born of pure, unadulterated ambition, with no connection to the humble, simple and in her eyes shameful world from which she had sprung. I sat there, my body rigid, my heart a cold, dead stone in my chest. The pain was so immense, so total, that it had moved beyond the realm of simple emotion. It was a quiet, internal apocalypse, the loving, maternal part of my soul, the part that had always made excuses for her, the part that had always held on to the hope that my sweet little girl was still in there somewhere. That part of me was now gone. It had been murdered, right here in this quiet, pretty room, by the casual, careless cruelty of my own daughter's words. And in its place something new, something cold and something hard as a diamond was beginning to form. I heard Genevieve's voice, cool and non-committal. Well, she said, family is complicated. It was a diplomat's answer, a non-answer, a quiet, powerful judgment. We should get back to the party, Naomi said, her voice once again the bright, cheerful sound of the happy bride. The transaction was complete. She believed she had successfully aligned herself with the new power. I listened as their footsteps receded, the sound of their quiet, confident laughter a final echoing insult. And I was left alone in the shadows, with the ghost of my husband, the memory of our life, and the cold, hard and undeniable truth of my daughter's betrayal. As their laughter faded back into the din of the reception, I remained on the bench, a statue carved from grief. The beautiful, fragrant atrium now felt like a tomb. The gurgling of the fountain was a mocking, cheerful sound in the face of my profound, silent devastation. The cruelty of Naomi's words was a multifaceted, exquisitely painful thing. It wasn't just the insult, the casual, brutal dismissal of my life as a pathetic failure. It was the context. It was the audience. She had not said these things to me in a private, angry argument. She had said them to Genevieve Sinclair, the one person in the world she was most desperate to impress. It was a strategic move. A calculated act of social and familial triangulation, to elevate Genevieve. She had to diminish me, to prove her worthiness to join this new powerful dynasty. She had to publicly, if secretly, renounce the old one. She was like a desperate immigrant, renouncing her citizenship to a poor, forgotten homeland in the hopes of being granted a passport to a richer, more powerful nation. And I was that poor, forgotten homeland. The deeper, more agonizing twist of the dagger, however, was her dismissal of her father. To call James a dreamer in that context was to call him a fool. To say he never understood ambition was to willfully and cruelly ignore the fierce, passionate ambition he had poured into his music, into his art, into the very act of bringing beauty and soul into the world. His ambition wasn't for money, it was for meaning, and his daughter, my daughter, had just looked at that beautiful, meaningful life, and had declared it worthless. I thought of all the sacrifices he had made for her, the late-night gigs he had played to pay for her dance lessons, the vintage piano he had sold, a piece of his own musical history to help with the down payment on her first car, the hours and hours he had spent with her, not teaching her about ambition but teaching her about love, about kindness, about the quiet, unshakable dignity of a life lived with integrity. And she had taken that inheritance, the true invaluable inheritance of his character, and she had just thrown it away. Casually, contemptuously, as if it were a piece of junk. The pain in my chest was so intense it was a physical thing. It felt like a great gaping wound, But as I sat there in the dark, something began to happen. The grief which had been a paralyzing, all-consuming force began to recede, and in its place, a new, colder, and far more powerful emotion began to rise. It was resolve. A cold, quiet, and utterly unshakable resolve. My daughter had not just insulted me. She had not just dishonored her father's memory. She had broken a sacred, unspoken trust. And that, I knew, could not go unanswered. I remembered James's words, his final prescient and deeply loving command. Only play it if you feel like she's truly forgotten who we are. Only play it if you need to remind her. She had forgotten. Oh yes. She had completely and utterly forgotten. She had, in her desperate social climbing ambition, erased us from her heart. It was time to remind her. It was no longer about revenge. It was not about hurting her, not really. It was about truth. It was about honoring the memory of my husband. It was about setting the record straight in the most public and undeniable way imaginable. My daughter had just delivered her own secret toast, a toast of contempt and dismissal. Now it was time for her father to deliver his. My hand closed around the small, cold metal recorder in my purse. It no longer felt like a memento. It felt like a weapon of truth. And I was about to deploy it. I stood up from the bench, my movements no longer the slow, weary motions of a grieving mother, but the sharp, decisive movements of a woman with a mission. The pain was still there, a cold, heavy stone in my chest, but it was no longer a paralyzing force. It was a fuel, a cold, clean, and highly efficient fuel. I walked out of the quiet, green atrium and back into the loud, glittering world of the wedding reception. The scene was the same, but I was not. I was seeing everything through a new, colder, and much clearer lens. The beautiful, laughing guests now looked like a collection of fools, celebrating a marriage that was a fraudulent, transactional sham. The opulent floral arrangements seemed to be weeping. The happy, swinging music of the band now sounded like a funeral dirge. I saw Naomi back at the head table laughing at something her new husband had said. Her face was a mask of radiant, bridal joy. The speed with which she could shift from the cold, contemptuous conspirator to the adoring, happy bride was a thing of almost clinical, sociopathic brilliance. And in that moment, any last, lingering flicker of maternal softness I might have felt for her was extinguished. She was not my daughter. She was a stranger, a very good actress who happened to be wearing my daughter's face. My decision was made. It was no longer a question of if I would play the recording. It was only a question of when and how. I made my way back to my table, my steps measured and deliberate. The other guests, the senators' wives and the CEO's spouses, gave me warm, polite smiles. I smiled back, a serene, placid mask that concealed the raging Arctic storm within. I sat down and took a sip of my ice water. My hand was perfectly steady. The teacher in me, the woman who had spent 40 years commanding the attention of unruly children, was planning her final, most important lesson, a lesson in consequences, a lesson in truth. I knew the moment had to be perfect. It could not be a private confrontation. A private confrontation would allow for lies, for gaslighting, for her to twist the narrative and once again cast me as the hysterical, overbearing mother. No, the wound had been inflicted in a semi-public if secret space. The correction, the antidote had to be administered in the most public way possible, in front of everyone, in front of her new, powerful family, in front of the entire world she was so desperate to impress. She had just in her mind successfully passed her audition for the role of Naomi Sinclair. I was about to give her a final, devastating callback, one she would never ever forget. My hand went to my purse, my fingers closing around the small, powerful and deeply loving weapon my husband had left me. I thought of his face, his kind, gentle eyes, the soulful, beautiful music he had made. He had been a man of peace, but he had also been a man of profound, unshakable integrity, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that he would have wanted me to do this. He would have wanted the truth to have the final, beautiful and heartbreaking solo. The clinking of a spoon against a champagne glass, a sharp, clear and attention-grabbing sound, cut through the din of the ballroom. The best man, a handsome, affable young man who had been Lawrence's roommate at Duke, was standing at the podium, a microphone in his hand. It was time for the toasts. A hush fell over the room. The string quartet, which had been playing a gentle, unobtrusive melody, segued into a soft, romantic theme. A wave of expectant, happy energy washed over the crowd. This was the heart of the celebration, the moment for public declarations of love, for funny anecdotes and tearful well wishes. I sat at my table, a small, quiet island of cold resolve in this warm sea of sentimentality. I watched as the best man delivered a charming, witty, and genuinely funny speech. He told a story about Lawrence in college, a story of loyalty and friendship that made the whole room laugh. He ended with a heartfelt, emotional toast to his best friend and his beautiful new bride. The room erupted in applause. Next came the maid of honor, Naomi's best friend from her PR firm. She was a stylish, emotional young woman who wept her way through a speech about their friendship, about how she had never seen Naomi so happy, so complete. It was a beautiful, if slightly overwrought, performance. More applause. Then, Genevieve Sinclair rose from her seat at the head table. She moved to the podium with the easy, commanding grace of a woman who was born to be in the spotlight. She was a formidable presence, her elegant, silver-streaked hair swept up, her designer gown a shimmering column of dark, powerful silk. She did not need a microphone. Her voice, a low, cultured, and deeply authoritative instrument, filled the entire room. Her toast was a masterpiece. It was not emotional. It was a powerful, eloquent, and deeply strategic speech. She spoke of her pride in her son, Lawrence. Not just as a mother but as a business partner. She spoke of his talent, his integrity, his vision. Then, she turned her gaze to Naomi. And in Naomi, she said, her voice warm but with an unmistakable edge of steel, my son has found a partner who matches his own drive, his own ambition, a woman who is not afraid of the future, but is determined to build it. We are not just gaining a daughter today, the Sinclair family, and the city of Atlanta is gaining a new powerful force. We welcome you to the family, Naomi, and we look forward to the empire you will build together. It was a brilliant, almost feudal speech. It was a queen anointing a new princess, a public declaration of acceptance into the dynasty. I watched Naomi's face as she listened. She was drinking in every word, her expression one of pure, unadulterated triumph. This was it, the culmination of her life's work, the final public validation she had so desperately craved. She had done it. She had successfully traded in her old, pathetic family for this new, powerful one. Genevieve raised her glass. To Lawrence and Naomi, she declared. To the future. The room thundered with applause, and in that moment of her absolute triumphant glory, the band leader smiled and looked over at my table. And now, he announced, his voice a cheerful booming sound, we would be honored to hear a few words from the mother of the bride, Mrs. Sarah Brooks. All eyes in the room swiveled to me. 400 pairs of curious, expectant, and slightly pitying eyes. I was the final act in this carefully orchestrated play, the sweet, sentimental, and ultimately insignificant epilogue to the main event. They were expecting a few tearful, cliché-ridden words from the quiet little music teacher, a humble, emotional, and ultimately forgettable toast. I took a sip of my ice water, the cool liquid a welcome balm to my suddenly dry throat. The moment was here. There was no turning back. I stood up, my movements slow, measured, and deliberate. I did not feel nervous. I felt a strange, almost out-of-body calm. The grief and the rage had been distilled into a single, pure, and unshakable purpose. I was no longer Sarah Brooks, the grieving widow, the wounded mother. I was an instrument of my husband's final loving will. I made my way to the small stage, my simple handmade dress a whisper of dark violet in a sea of glittering sequins and silks. I walked past the head table. I did not look at Genevieve or Lawrence. My eyes were fixed on my daughter. Naomi was smiling at me, a bright, beautiful, and deeply condescending smile. It was the smile of a winner, a smile that was a mixture of pity and impatience. The look a queen gives to a loyal but slightly boring subject. Get on with it, old woman, her smile said. Say your piece so we can get back to the party. I reached the podium. It was a sleek, modern, lucite thing, utterly at odds with the warm, worn wood of the lecterns I was used to in my old school auditorium. I adjusted the microphone, the small movement echoing in the silent, expectant room. I looked out at the sea of faces, at the powerful, wealthy, and influential audience. They were all watching me, their expressions a mixture of politeness and curiosity. They were the world my daughter had chosen, and they were about to be the jury in the trial of her character. Thank you, I began, and I was surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. It was clear, it was strong, and it carried to every corner of the vast, silent hall. Thank you all for being here to celebrate my daughter Naomi, and my new son Lawrence. I paused, letting the simple conventional words hang in the air. I am not a woman who is comfortable with public speaking, I continued, my voice taking on a soft, almost confessional tone. My husband James. He was the wordsmith in our family. I was the quiet one, and at moments like this I feel his absence, his silence more than ever. I saw a few of the older guests nod in sympathy. I had them. I was the grieving widow, the humble mother. I don't have a prepared speech, I said, and this was the truth. The words I had in my heart for my daughter today were simple ones. Words of love, of pride, of hope for her future. I let my gaze rest on Naomi. Her smile had become a little tighter, a little more impatient. But my late husband James, I said, my voice now imbued with a new, stronger emotion, was a man who always had a song in his heart, and the right words on his mind. He couldn't be here today to see his beautiful daughter on her wedding day, a day he dreamed of for her entire life. But he was a man who always planned ahead, and he wanted more than anything to give her a final gift, a final piece of himself. He left a message for her, and with that I reached into my small beaded purse and I took out the silver digital recorder. The small silver recorder felt cool and solid in my hand. It was a simple, unassuming object, but in the charged, silent atmosphere of the ballroom, it seemed to pulse with a latent power. I held it up for a moment, letting the stage lights glint off its metallic surface. A ripple of confused, curious murmuring went through the crowd. This was not part of the standard wedding script. This was unexpected, unconventional. I looked at my daughter. The condescending, impatient smile was gone from her face, replaced by a look of pure, uncomprehending confusion. Her eyes were narrowed, trying to process what I was doing. What new, embarrassing, and deeply unsophisticated breach of etiquette was her simple mother about to commit? I ignored her. I ignored the whispers from the crowd. I was no longer speaking to them. I was speaking to her. And I was speaking for James. My voice, when I spoke again, was no longer my own. It was a voice of pure, unwavering purpose. The voice of a woman carrying out a sacred final duty. My husband was a man of music, I said, my voice clear and strong, cutting through the low murmur of the room. He believed that a melody could say more than 1,000 words, but a single honest note could contain a lifetime of love. He was not a man of great material wealth. He could not have afforded a wedding like this. He could not have given his daughter a life of luxury. I paused, letting the words, a subtle but clear indictment of the world they were all celebrating, settle. But he was a man who was rich. I continued, my voice swelling with a quiet, powerful pride. In the things that truly matter, he was rich in love, in integrity, in soul, and that was the inheritance he wanted to leave for his only child. I looked directly at Naomi, and for the first time I let a flicker of the cold, hard truth of my own knowledge show in my eyes. He was worried. In his final days, I said, my voice dropping to a low, intimate, and deeply accusatory tone that was for her, and her alone. He was worried that in her great and admirable ambition she might lose her way, that she might, in her search for a new glittering world, forget the simple, profound truths of the world she came from. Naomi's face, which had been confused, was now beginning to show the first faint glimmers of alarm. Her eyes widened slightly. The smile was completely gone now. And so, I said, bringing the recorder closer to the microphone, he left her this, a final message. A father's last words of love, and of guidance, for his daughter on her wedding day. A final piece of his heart, and he asked me to play it for her, at this very moment. I looked out at the silent, watching crowd. I looked at the powerful, impassive face of Genevieve Sinclair. I looked at the confused, worried face of Lawrence, her new husband, and then I looked back at my daughter, at her beautiful and now deeply, deeply frightened face. So if you will all indulge a grieving widow, I said, my voice now a soft, almost tender whisper, I would like to let my husband James Brooks give his own toast to his daughter. And with a hand that was as steady as a rock, I held the small silver recorder up to the microphone and I pressed the play button. For a moment, there was only the soft, almost imperceptible hiss of digital silence. The entire vast ballroom seemed to be holding its collective breath. Naomi was frozen, her face a mask of dawning, horrified comprehension. She knew in that moment, she knew that this was not going to be a simple, loving message. This was a reckoning. And then, his voice filled the room. It was not the weak, reedy voice of a dying man. The recording was from a few months before the end, when his spirit was still strong, and his voice, that beautiful, soulful, and deeply familiar baritone, was as rich and as warm as ever. It was the sound of my husband, the sound of her father, and it was so clear, so present, it was as if he were standing on the stage right beside me. The recording began with the soft, gentle sound of him clearing his throat. And then he spoke. "My darling girl," his voice began, and the sound of it, the pure unadulterated love in those 3 simple words, was a physical blow. It was a sound of such profound, paternal affection that it immediately and brutally exposed the lie of the cruel, dismissive words she had spoken just an hour before. I saw Naomi flinch as if she had been struck. I saw her hand fly to her mouth. "My Naomi, if you are hearing this, it means I am not there to walk you down the aisle. It means I am not there to give some long, embarrassing speech, and to dance with you to our favorite song, and for that, my love, I am more sorry than words can ever say. But I am there. I am there in the music. I am there in the love that is filling this room, and I am with you now." A wave of audible, emotional sighs went through the crowd. The guests were captivated, moved by this posthumous message of a father's love. They thought this was a beautiful, sentimental surprise. They had no idea it was an execution. "I have been thinking a lot, in these last days," his voice continued, a new, more serious note entering his tone, "about what a father wants for his daughter. What is the legacy a man leaves behind? It is not a house. It is not a bank account. It is, I think, a set of values, a compass for the heart." He paused, and the silence seemed to stretch, filled with the weight of his words. "Your mother and I, we never had much money. Naomi, I know that was a source of frustration for you sometimes. I know our world, a world of old books and late-night jam sessions, was not the glittering world you dreamed of. But I pray you understand that in our own way, we were the richest people I have ever known. We had music, we had our community, we had a love that was as real and as solid as the ground beneath our feet. And we had you, and you, my darling girl, you were the greatest treasure of our lives." I watched my daughter's face. It was no longer frightened, it was crumbling. Her beautiful, carefully constructed mask of composure was dissolving, revealing the raw, ugly, and deeply shamed face of a daughter being confronted with a love she had so casually and so cruelly betrayed. Tears were now streaming down her face, carving paths through her expensive makeup. The recording was no longer just playing in the room. It was playing in her soul, and the final devastating movement of her father's last symphony was just about to begin. James's voice, so full of warmth and love, was a stark, brutal contrast to the cold, hard reality of what was happening in that ballroom. He was a ghost, a voice from the past, speaking a language of love and integrity to a daughter who had just in secret declared herself fluent in the language of greed and contempt. The final part of his message was not for the room, it was not for the guests. It was a laser-guided missile, aimed directly at the heart of his daughter's soul. "I know you have found a new life, my darling girl," his voice continued, the gentle, loving tone now imbued with a deep, sorrowful wisdom. "A life of ambition, of success, of the kind of wealth and power your mother and I never knew, and I am so, so proud of the brilliant, capable woman you have become. I pray that you find all the happiness you are searching for in that world." He paused, and the sound of him taking a slow, slightly ragged breath was a heartbreaking reminder of his frailty, of the effort these final words were costing him. "But my final wish for you, Naomi," he said, and his voice dropped to a low, intimate, and deeply serious murmur, as if he were leaning in to tell her one last crucial secret. "My final lesson from your old dreamer of a father is this: in your search for that new, glittering life, do not lose your soul, do not become so dazzled by the price of things that you forget their value. Because the only real, true, and lasting fortune we ever had to give you was your mother's love." The words landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. I saw Genevieve Sinclair's eyes, which had been full of a polite, detached sympathy, suddenly narrow, a flicker of sharp, analytical understanding dawning in them. She was a smart woman. She was beginning to understand that this was not just a sentimental message. This was a chess move. James's voice, now thick with a profound, almost unbearable emotion, delivered the final, devastating lines. "It is a fortune she has given you freely, unconditionally, every single day of your life. It is the most valuable thing in this world. And my only prayer, my final dying prayer for you, my darling daughter, is that you never ever make the mistake of treating it like it's junk." He had used the word from the old painful memory of the prom night. The word that was a synonym for his life, his passion in his daughter's eyes, and he had turned it with a final, heartbreaking flourish into the cornerstone of his last lesson. The recording ended. The soft hiss of the digital silence was the only sound. The lesson was delivered, the truth was out, and the room, All 400 of the most powerful and influential people in Atlanta fell completely and utterly silent. The silence that followed the end of my husband's message was not a peaceful silence. It was a dense, heavy and deeply uncomfortable thing, a vacuum created by the sudden shocking collision of a beautiful loving truth, and a cold, ugly and now painfully obvious lie. Every single person in that vast, opulent ballroom was completely utterly still. They were no longer guests at a wedding. They were a jury, and they had just heard the final devastating piece of testimony. And they were all, every single one of them, staring at my daughter. Naomi was no longer the radiant, triumphant bride. She was a defendant in the dock, exposed, humiliated, and judged in the court of her own wedding. Her face was a pale, ashen mask of pure public horror. The tears that had been streaming down her face had stopped. She was frozen, a statue of shame, her beautiful, expensive dress now feeling like a prisoner's uniform. She was not looking at me. She was not looking at the shocked, whispering guests. She was looking at the two people in the world whose opinion now mattered more than anything. Her new husband and her new mother-in-law. Lawrence was staring at her, his handsome, kind face a mixture of deep, profound confusion and a dawning, sickening understanding. He had just heard her own loving deceased father deliver a gentle, heartbreaking and utterly undeniable rebuke. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind, and the beautiful, perfect image he had held of his bride was shattering right before his eyes. But it was the expression on Genevieve Sinclair's face that was the most devastating indictment of all. Her face, which had been a mask of polite, social grace, was now a thing of pure, cold and utterly unforgiving judgment. There was no sympathy in her eyes, no pity. There was only the cold, hard assessment of a CEO who has just discovered a fatal character flaw in a new, high-DAS acquisition. She was looking at my daughter not as a new member of her family but as a liability, a bad investment, a woman who had just in the most public way imaginable, revealed herself to be disloyal, disrespectful, and fundamentally untrustworthy. In Genevieve's world, these were not just personal failings. They were capital crimes. The silence stretched on, a long, agonizing and deeply satisfying moment of pure, unadulterated consequence. My daughter had wanted to impress Genevieve, to align herself with her power, to be seen as her equal, and in a single terrible and beautifully ironic twist of fate, she had just in front of the entire world, proven herself to be the one thing that a woman like Genevieve Sinclair would never ever tolerate. A fool. Naomi finally, shakily got to her feet. She looked as if she were about to say something, to try and explain, to spin some new, desperate lie, but she couldn't. There were no words. What could she possibly say? Her own father's voice, a voice of pure, unimpeachable love and integrity, had just rendered her utterly, completely and irrevocably silent. I did not wait for my daughter to speak. I did not wait for the whispers to erupt into full-blown conversation. My part in this play was over. The final loving and devastating word had been spoken not by me but by my husband, and it was time for me to make my exit. With a quiet, unshakable dignity that I knew my James would have been proud of, I stepped down from the podium. I did not look at the shocked, gossiping guests. I did not look at the cold, calculating face of Genevieve Sinclair, or the heartbroken, disillusioned one of her son. I looked only once, and briefly, at my daughter. Naomi was standing by the head table, a solitary, broken figure in her cloud of white lace. Her face was a mess of ruined makeup and pure, unadulterated shame. Our eyes met across the silent, cavernous room, and in her eyes, I saw not anger or hatred, but the dawning, terrible and life-altering understanding of what she had lost. Not just her pride, not just her standing, but the one thing she had so carelessly, so contemptuously thrown away, the unconditional love of her parents. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of forgiveness. It was a nod of finality, a quiet, maternal amen to her father's sermon. And then I turned. I walked through the silent, watching crowd. They parted before me, a sea of stunned, respectful faces. I was no longer the sweet, simple, slightly embarrassing mother of the bride. I was a woman of quiet, formidable, and deeply underestimated power. I was a woman who had just, with a grace and a precision that was a thing of beauty, defended her own honor and the memory of the man she loved. I walked out of the grand, opulent ballroom, out of the world of my daughter's choosing and into the cool, quiet, and blessedly real air of the Atlanta night. I did not look back. I did not need to. I had left my daughter alone in the center of that silent, judgmental room. Alone with her new husband, her new family, and the echoing, loving, and deeply disappointed voice of her father. She had gotten the life she had always dreamed of, the wealth, the status, the power, but she had in the process lost her soul. Whether she would ever be able to find it again, whether she would ever be able to earn back the love and the trust she had so casually desecrated, was no longer my concern. That was her journey now, her lesson to learn. I had done my final duty as her mother. I had delivered her father's final message. I had spoken my truth in his, and as I walked away into the quiet, starlit darkness, I felt not a sense of triumph, but a profound, weary, and deeply sorrowful peace. The room had fallen silent, and so at last had the long, painful argument in my own heart.